Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this first in a series of joint seminars between the UK-based UACES and the Irish-based IACES. And this is the first of a series of seminars around the theme of the UK, Ireland, and the European Union in a time of crisis. So a very pertinent set of seminars, I'm sure, will materialise from that. The first one today, we are looking at the COVID pandemic, confronting the coronavirus pandemic, obviously extremely pertinent from a kind of UK, Irish and EU perspective. Can I just begin by thanking the President of IACES, Mary Murphy, for her collaboration in this project with UACES. My name is Nick Startin, I'm the current chair of UACES. We're really delighted that this series is going ahead. This cross-border virtual cooperation, I think, is very pertinent in the current climate in which we find ourselves. We've got a really big hitting, heavy hitting introduction to the seminar today. So before I actually introduce our very distinguished panel, we will hear some words from the Irish Taoiseach, who I think would like to introduce himself with regard to this seminar series. So Emily, over to you, please, to play that short video before we start.
It is an honour to open this afternoon's inaugural event at the invitation of Dr. Mary Murphy, President of the Irish Association for Contemporary European Studies. Since its inception in the early 1970s, the association has established a footprint of excellence in bringing together scholars and practitioners from across the island of Ireland for informed discussion on European issues. Let me commend you at the outset for this new initiative with your British equivalent, the University Association for Contemporary European Studies, an association that is also renowned for the calibre of your teaching and research. Your theme for this afternoon's seminar, Confronting the Coronavirus Pandemic, is as important as it is topical. By any measure, these are historic times, and they demand of us all that we step up to the challenge and play our part in responding. It is no exaggeration to describe the COVID-19 crisis as the greatest test of global solidarity in generations, and a stark reminder of our interdependence. In a deeply interconnected world, public health can only be as strong as the weakest health system. Rapidly expanded access to tests, treatments and vaccines, premised on recognising immunisation as a global public good, must become part of a more strongly coordinated and delivery-focused international response. We must not lose sight of the fact that the disease is our common enemy and that international cooperation and solidarity is necessary to counter its impacts. As the World Health Organization has put it, none of us is safe until all of us are safe. The pandemic has coincided with the departure of the United Kingdom from the European Union. In truth, the necessary focus on COVID-19 and its impacts has, to a significant degree, masked the disruptions and complications that Brexit has caused. Since the start of this year, Great Britain has been outside the single market and the customs union, while Northern Ireland is now in a unique position as a result of the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland. There has been significant disruption to normal trade flows and supply chains as enterprises and citizens here in Northern Ireland and in Great Britain have had to get to grips with new realities and new and more demanding administrative requirements. I've always said that there was no such thing as a good Brexit, only one in which we worked to minimise the inevitable disruption. And that is what we achieved in the withdrawal agreement and in the trade and cooperation agreement between the European Union and the United Kingdom. Throughout the negotiations, our priority in Ireland was to protect the Good Friday Agreement, including in avoiding a hard border, and to ensure the least possible disruption to trade, including tariff and quota-free exchange. This was the case across the political spectrum here. We also, of course, were determined to protect the European Union's single market and Ireland's place within it, and that has been achieved. We will continue to work closely with partners to make sure that the agreements are implemented as fully and smoothly as possible. But they can never replace the seamlessness of EU membership. Most importantly, we will continue to strive for the implementation of the protocol on Northern Ireland in a way that minimises the disruption to the day-to-day lives of people in Northern Ireland insofar as is possible. There are many benefits and opportunities inherent in the protocol for Northern Ireland, and so part of the work of the months and years to come will be to identify and to maximise those opportunities. However, there is no escaping the fact that these new agreements constitute a very significant change. In that context, it is worth recalling that Ireland's wholehearted membership of the European Union has never been in question. It is our home and our future. It is a commitment based on much more than just the economic benefits that membership has brought us. Ireland and the United Kingdom's shared membership of the European Union enriched relations between our two islands. Now that common ground is no longer there, there's an increased responsibility on all of us to find new ways and new mechanisms to ensure that we do not drift apart and that we continue to work together to interrogate shared challenges, to explore common interests, and in pursuit of excellence as we enter this new chapter in our relationship. Prime Minister Johnson and I are both committed to moving forward with an ambitious new agenda to reset and refresh our cooperation in the post-Brexit context. We should be ambitious about what we can achieve for the benefit of all our people, looking at how we enhance connectivity across these islands, deepening our cooperation on green initiatives, working together to deliver sustainable economic recovery from the pandemic, and cooperating on global international issues. We will, of course, need to put in place structures to underpin this engagement, with regular meetings by heads of government at ministerial and senior official levels to deliver on agreed programmes of work. A strong and robust relationship with our closest neighbour, even in this complex and shifting global environment, remains a key priority for this government. The government is also placing a major focus on sustaining and deepening relationships at all levels across the island of Ireland through our Shared Island initiative. We've made huge progress through the Good Friday Agreement since 1998. We need to build on that in the years ahead to deepen connections, trust and reconciliation between all communities and traditions on the island. Our Shared Island initiative is about harnessing the full potential of the Good Friday Agreement to build a better and reconciled future for everyone on the island. This is an agenda that everyone on the island, Irish, British, both or neither, can engage with confidently. It does not diminish or compromise anyone's identity or beliefs. This initiative is a whole of government priority, and I've established a Shared Island unit in my department to act as a driver and coordinator for this work. We want to work with the Executive and the British government to address the major challenges that we face together on the island, ensuring societal recovery from the pandemic, addressing the climate and biodiversity crisis, and working through the consequences of Brexit. And we want to fully take up the opportunities of North-South cooperation, for example, to grow the all-island economy and deepen mutually beneficial cooperation in key areas like health and higher education. In Budget 2021, the government established a Shared Island Fund with €500 million available over the next 5 years, ring-fenced for cross-border projects. This confirms our readiness and ambition to invest in our shared future on the island. We are working now with the Northern Ireland Executive and through the North-South Ministerial Council to drive progress with long-standing cross-border infrastructure commitments like the Ulster Canal, the Narrowwater Bridge and the A5 road transport corridor. And we aim to develop and deliver a new generation of collaborative cross-border investments that will contribute to progress on climate mitigation, transport connectivity, and an economy that fully harnesses talent and capacity right across the island. I've also had constructive engagement with Prime Minister Johnson on this initiative and conveyed our willingness to engage on an East-West basis. As part of the initiative, I've launched a Shared Island Dialogue series to foster inclusive civic discussion on all aspects of our shared future. The series commenced in November and will continue through this year, engaging with important issues for the future, including our environment, health, education and economy. We are also commissioning research that will be published to inform and stimulate discussions on how best we develop a shared island agenda in the years ahead. Strengthening social, economic and political links on the island is a key focus for the Shared Island Initiative. Progress with reconciliation will not just happen. We need to work shoulder to shoulder to meet the demands and take up the opportunities of our time. Our Shared Island Initiative is focused on ensuring that collectively we grasp this opportunity and work towards a shared, inclusive, reconciled future for all, founded on the Good Friday Agreement. Let me conclude by commending once again the organisers of this afternoon's inaugural event and conveying my very best wishes for this new collaboration between your respective organisations. The panel of distinguished contributors for this afternoon's event gives me every confidence in the quality of contribution you will bring to advancing scholarly dialogue and understanding on these islands in the period ahead. I wish you the very best for this new partnership.
So, plenty to reflect on there in the commentary from the Irish Taoiseach, and I'm sure on behalf of UACES, you'd like to, and IACES, join me in thanking him for taking the time to record that very pertinent and reflective intervention. He talked about the brilliant panel that we've got lined up. So without further ado, let me introduce the panel, and then I'll tell you a little bit about how this afternoon's seminar is going to function. I'll start with the two Irish-based colleagues first, if that's okay. So we have Noel O'Connell, who is the CEO of the European Movement and has been since 2011, which, as most of you will be aware, is Ireland's longest established not-for-profit organisation which connects Ireland with Europe. She was also an elected vice president of the European Movement International, which encompasses 34 countries and 38 international associations. I could go on, there's plenty more on her CV, but if she'll permit me, I'll move on to our next speaker. Our second speaker is Fiona Kearney, the founding director of the Glucksman Art Museum, which many of you will know is on the campus of University College Cork. And this museum promotes the creation, understanding and enjoyment of art. Fiona has a very distinguished academic career as well, which I could certainly wax lyrical about, but for the sake of time, I'll move on to our third speaker. Our third speaker is Dr. Ellie Brooks, who is a lecturer in global health policy from the University of Edinburgh. Eleanor currently holds a UKRI Future Leaders Fellowship, a very prestigious fellowship, supporting the Better Regulation for Better Health project, which examines the impact of the EU's better regulation agenda on its health policy. And she works at Edinburgh as part of the Global Health Policy Unit. Our final speaker is Professor Tamara Hervey, who is a Jean Monnet Professor of European Union Law at the University of Sheffield. And Tamara has a very distinguished career in academia, working on areas like transnational, global and comparative health law, equality and diversity, legal investigation. And she is currently the principal investigator of health governance after Brexit, which is an ERSC funded project that investigates the effects of Brexit on health. So that is our very eminent four-person panel for this afternoon's proceedings. If I could just give you a short idea of how it's going to operate. Each speaker will address the virtual audience for 5 minutes each, and they are going to talk essentially about how they see the current situation surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic in the context of the UK, Ireland and the EU. And they will obviously give us their insightful personal take on this as both practitioners and academics. Once we've had their 5-minute interventions, I will then ask a series of individual questions to each panelist. And from there, time permitting, we will go to a question and answer session where you will have the opportunity to put up the dreaded virtual hand on chat if you would like to ask a question. And if time permits, we may even ask for some actual verbal questions from the floor as well. I don't think I need to conceptualize what this seminar is about. I think the Irish Prime Minister did that very effectively. So I think we'll go straight to our first speaker. And I have asked the first speaker, let me just check I've got my notes right here. We've asked Dr. Ellie Brooks to be our first speaker. Thank you, Ellie.
Thank you, Nick, for the introduction, and thank you to the organisers for the invitation. It's lovely to be, particularly on such a multidisciplinary panel. It's really impressive. So I was asked just to give a short overview of the EU's response to COVID, sort of from the perspective of its health policy, and I think we can usefully see that in 3 phases. So if we think right back to the beginning of the pandemic, we went through a period where the responses were unilateral, they were almost protectionist in nature, and they were very much at the national level. So we saw the introduction of bans on exports of personal protective equipment and other critical medical supplies. We saw restrictions on borders in particular places. And we saw a lack of coordination responding to things like Italy's request for assistance back in March of last year. And these things really threaten the fundamental pillars of the Union. So particularly solidarity, the principle that is meant to underpin the relationship between the member states, but also the freedom of movement, right, so the cornerstone of the whole European project itself. But that phase finished quite quickly, and we moved then into a phase that I think was characterised much more by a cooperative approach. So the Commission engaged in some relatively successful diplomacy to remove those export bans and those restrictions on movement. It then made some amendments to a series of legislation that might otherwise, I think, have risked hampering the national response. So, for example, we saw amendments to state aid law that might otherwise have stopped governments from being able to support industries and companies that needed support. We saw the delay of implementation of particular pieces of legislation. So a good example there would be the Medical Devices Directive. We were meant to get new rules about how medical devices are manufactured last year, but the date of implementation for that was postponed to allow those companies to focus on their contribution to the COVID response. And at a much broader level, we saw very quickly relaxation of the fiscal governance framework. So acknowledging that it's probably not reasonable to expect governments to adhere to budget limits and ceilings on their spending when they're trying to respond to a crisis of this magnitude. So I think that the common thread through those amendments was to make sure that EU law wasn't getting in the way of a national response while we figured out what it was that the EU could do to help. Perhaps a little bit more slowly, we then saw some of the health and the emergency response mechanisms come into play. So the joint procurement mechanism, whereby we negotiate and purchase not only vaccines, but also critical medical supplies collectively, that started to come into motion, and the Commission was negotiating and finalising those contracts sort of through the middle of last year is when that started. We saw also a creation of a stockpile for medical resources that hadn't existed before for critical medical goods. And we saw the coming into play of the Union Civil Protection Mechanism as well. So that was used to repatriate citizens that were stranded in other member states back to their home member states. It was also used to dispatch medical teams to particular hotspots where infections were very high. So I mean, there was criticism, and I think probably fairly levelled at the pace at which some of those mechanisms came into play. And there are certainly lessons that we can learn about the governance mechanisms behind them and how responsive those are. But I think it's worth noting at this point with those first 2 phases that what happened in those 2 phases was probably to be expected based on the competencies and the capacities that the EU has. So the tools that we needed and the levers that needed to be pulled in that immediate period of the early crisis exist at national level. So governments decide whether lockdowns will be put in place, governments decide whether masks will be mandatory in public spaces, governments decide whether furlough schemes need to be brought in to sort of stem unemployment and what those schemes should look like. All of those things exist at national level. So I think there's a logic to the initial response having been a largely sort of national focused one. What allowed the EU to step in and to start playing a bit more of a role was those barriers to free movement. So as soon as you start to see the export bans and border restrictions and things, that's where the EU starts to play a role. So at the very extreme end there, the Court of Justice of the EU can sanction states that impede the free movement of goods. So that was sort of the point at which the door was opened for the EU to step in a little bit more proactively, if you like. In terms of where we are right now, I think we could probably characterize phase 3 as a sort of delicate balancing act. So we've seen the reintroduction of some border restrictions in some places. We saw for a very short period of time a Europe-wide export ban on vaccines with near disastrous consequences at the Northern Irish border. There are clearly some issues with vaccine procurement, and there's a lot of tension there. I would also throw in there, I think that those tensions, whilst the issue is new, the tensions themselves are not. So we're seeing a backwards and forwards of blame shifting between the national level and the European administration. Clearly, there are some lessons for the Commission to learn about negotiating these contracts. On the other hand, we see reports that in some countries, the vaccines are there, but they're not being administered. So the problem is clearly not only a supply problem. That backwards and forwards and that shifting of blame isn't a new thing for the EU in its relation with its member states. It's just the issue there that's a new one. Alongside all of that, though, in those tensions, we've seen quite a lot of support and quite a lot of pushing forward with strengthening the EU's role in health. So middle of last year, we had approved a new health programme, and the budget for that health programme is somewhere around about 20 times the size of the budget for the previous health programme, and that was all signed off towards the end of last year. We also saw in November then proposals that are designed to underpin the creation of a European health union. And within that, we would see the strengthening of the mandates of key agencies like the Centre for Disease Prevention and Control and the European Medicines Agency, and really just a strengthening of the role and the responsibilities of the EU as a whole. So I think those things perhaps sound a little bit like they stand in contrast, excuse me. But where I would say we see the EU at right now is perhaps trying to balance two things. So on the one hand, it's trying to manage what is clearly a really complex and very politically sensitive response to the pandemic. On the other hand, it's trying to sort of build on and harness that momentum that's come from having health so high on the agenda to shore up its role and maybe strengthen its role in health as we move forward. So those, I think, are the two sets of tasks that it's engaged in. And as we roll forward, I imagine we'll see sort of challenges and barriers to both of those tasks as we push ahead.
Thank you very much, Ellie, for that first intervention. That's kicked off proceedings very well indeed. Thank you. If I could ask Noel O'Connell now to make our second intervention. Thank you very much, Noel.
Thank you, Nick. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to Mary and yourself for the invitation to speak to you all today. So in terms of my address, I'd like to focus a little bit on the issue of health policy in the EU by, I guess, framing it somewhat in the past, having a snapshot of the present, and looking briefly forwards in the future. So I suppose to begin, we must look back, and the EU, as we know, always had a limited role in terms of health policy, as that is the responsibility that rests firmly in the hands of member states and was quite jealously guarded in those hands, sitting high as it does on the national political agenda, making member states, making national governments reluctant to cede greater power to the EU being more involved in health policy. And this fact is borne out and underlined by the fact that the relevant article in the Treaty on Health Policy, Article 168, largely relates to how the EU can complement national health policies. And it's hard to believe in the world BC, as I call it, before COVID, before coronavirus, as we approach the 1-year anniversary of the pandemic properly, I suppose kicking off in terms of March timeframe, it looked as if health would not play a prominent policy role in the EU's future. If we look at the Commission's 2017 white paper on the future of Europe, that actually suggested public health was one area where the EU should limit its involvement. And as a result, health policy featured only when it related primarily to the single market, such as health professional regulations, or to the regulation of pharmaceutical and medical devices. And indeed, a recent investigation by the EU Ombudsman, Emily O'Reilly, on the European Centre of Disease Control's initial response to COVID-19 found that a lack of resources impacted the CDC's response. And just in comparison, I suppose that organisation employs just under 290 staff, whilst the US Centre for Disease Control has a staff of over 10,000. And then coming to my second point today, the EU's response to the pandemic, and I think as Ellie said, nobody on this call today would probably disagree that the initial response was less than ideal, but we have to be mindful and cognizant of the fact as well that it was a crisis the EU has never faced before in a policy area that it had little prior responsibility for. So in those first weeks, we saw the member states marching forward, taking their own unilateral measures, such as closing borders, imposing PPE export bans, etc. But in fairness, the EU quickly adapted to the crisis and tried to begin rolling out a stream of concrete initiatives. And I think sometimes that gets lost in the maelstrom of the noise that surrounds this topic. But let's mention just one example. Rescue EU is a decentralized stockpile of medical equipment which member states and non-EU countries can draw from. And just last Friday, a week ago, 1.5 million surgical masks, 100,000 FFP3 masks, and 100,000 protective suits and gloves were delivered to Moldova. Notwithstanding that, some recent actions certainly have resulted in some valid criticism. Certainly the decision to trigger Article 16 of the protocol before a couple of hours later, a swift retraction by the Commission was, to be diplomatic about it, deeply unfortunate. I could use stronger terminology, but I won't. And I think Commissioner Mairead McGuinness said that I'm afraid the political reality of the paragraph wasn't understood. And I think the aftermath and the fallout of that, it's hopefully a little bit better understood now. And that all flowed from the AstraZeneca Commission disagreement for the alleged breach of the contract terms, and combined with frustrations over the pace of the COVID-19 vaccine rollout, alongside the European Medicine Agency's slower approval process in comparison to the UK, the EU's COVID-19 vaccine strategy has come under scrutiny. And that brings me, ladies and gentlemen, to my final point on the future of health policy at the EU level. So I've mentioned the somewhat undignified scramble by the member states in the initial weeks of the pandemic, but I think it's fair to say this is a marathon and not a sprint. The EU's collective approach in responding to COVID-19, albeit it's not perfect, it's never going to be, but it is the right approach, because I think it is only through the EU collectively cooperating towards a common goal, towards reinforcing solidarity, that success can be reached. Stemming from the COVID pandemic is the recently announced European Health Union strategy, and that aims to equip the EU and its member states to better prevent and address future pandemics. And I think it's interesting, a big part of my work with, as Vice President of European Movement International, is on the whole area of the Conference of the Future of Europe. And if you had asked me 2 years ago, would the whole topic of an EU public health, would that have featured as predominantly as it's going to, I would have definitely said not. But this is something now that we must debate and we must consider, because if we look as well, it's something that EU citizens want. In October 2020, polling from Kantar for the European Parliament found that an average of 66% of EU citizens agree that the European Union should have more competencies to deal with crises such as COVID-19. And in Ireland, that stood at 78%, fifth behind Malta, which topped the league at 87%. So I'll conclude by saying that frustrations do exist regarding the EU COVID-19 vaccine programme, but the alternative, and particularly for smaller member states, because I know from talking to colleagues in the pharmaceutical industry, there's absolutely no way that smaller member states with a population less than, in Ireland, the size of the population of London, it would have been a struggle to get access to the vaccines. If member states had sourced their own COVID-19 vaccines, that would have certainly resulted in a bidding war, upended EU solidarity, and leaving the smaller member states at a greater disadvantage. And by stepping in to coordinate a joint approach, albeit not perfectly, the EU, though, has ensured a level playing field on an issue so pressing and precious to us all. from the work of the European Central Bank, the European Investment Bank, to member states agreeing the historic 750 billion Next Gen EU Recovery Fund. Examples really that highlight to us that by acting collectively together, the EU is at its best, and we can't have a vaccine nationalism war. We need to cooperate and work together. And to quote Italy's new Prime Minister, Mario Draghi, who said just last week in his first public address, there is no sovereignty in solitude. Thank you very much. Look forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much, Noelle, for that excellent intervention. If I could ask our third speaker now to say a few words. Over to you, Fiona Kearney. Thank you very much.
So, thank you, Nick, and to Mary for the invitation and the opportunity to move from health to creative well-being. I'm going to speak a little bit of the role of the arts and the impact on the cultural sector as a result of the pandemic. I think the extreme restrictions that have been imposed on populations to manage the spread of COVID-19 have in some sense served to increase public appreciation for the arts, because listening to music, watching film, live streaming theatre, reading books, or hopefully remotely visiting museums has been one of the few ways that we can stretch ourselves beyond the confines of home, imaginatively enter worlds that are not within our own 5 kilometres. The arts have had a real capacity to touch us at a time when so much remains distant. In tandem with this engagement with cultural content is also the increased participation in creative activities as people discover the joy of making, drawing, composing, performing, often as a way to constructively manage their own well-being, what the author Sarah Baum has called the wonder and awe, the catharsis and reassurance, the guilty bliss of a fresh small object placed into the world that didn't exist just a couple of hours ago. In the Glucksman, my own museum, this kind of participation has enabled us to understand how we can reach global audiences through online activities and programs, leveraging university and Irish diaspora networks. We've recently run workshops that have had participants from as far afield as Australia, as well as all over the UK and the EU. And as we note, especially here in Cork, people have even signed up from Dublin. Alongside this renewed interest in creative practice, though, is the absolutely devastating impact of the lockdown on the wider arts sector, from the highly visible closure of major cultural institutions, museums, theatres and concert halls, to the loss of income for highly skilled arts workers whose low-paid earnings in the gig economy was already precarious and over the last year has completely disappeared. The response to the crisis is different within each nation state. Some had been mindful of the freelance workers, some less so. Here in Ireland, the National Campaign for the Arts launched a very powerful advocacy campaign, Save the Arts, which asked people to envisage a world with no culture. They used a quote by Samuel Beckett, who put it most eloquently: "Imagination dead, imagine." And it called on our sector and the wider public to take action to ensure that the arts community receives investment, not only to survive the pandemic, but to enable the sector to contribute meaningfully to the economic and societal recovery ahead. For there is a critical role for the arts, I would say, in the future of a post-pandemic EU and UK European cultural experience, to create a space not just to escape from a confined reality, but to discuss, learn and explore different realities together. A few years ago, the Glucksman partnered with the UCC's College of Medicine and Health on an exhibition entitled Living Loss, the Experience of Illness in Art. The doctor who collaborated with us on the development of the project, Professor Fergus Shanahan, wrote of his involvement. Science gives us a way of thinking about disease, but the arts and humanities provide insight, context and understanding of what it means to be ill. Diseases are black and white, described by facts, figures, categories, and concepts, but illness is coloured, nuanced by context, and shaped by individual circumstances. Ursula von der Leyen's formulation of the new European Bauhaus project places culture at the heart of the programme positioned to achieve the European Green Deal, with its emphasis on the innovative and multidisciplinary design-led approaches. If creative practice is truly to contribute to and thrive as part of this ambitious new direction, we need to create the conditions now that ensure that arts workers, particularly those in precarious or freelance employment, can fully participate in discussions and actions ahead. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Fiona. Thanks. Another excellent intervention. So if we could now move to Professor Tamara Hervey and potentially Cordelia, your desk cat as well, for our final commentary. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it's such a pleasure to be part of this this workshop, and I'm really looking forward to this kind of collaboration going forward with our European neighbours, and I hope, you know, in person in due course as well. I'm just, there we go, just letting the screen share catch up with me. Okay, so just a few words from me. First of all, a couple of words about my work. So I'm a legal scholar by background, but I work across the disciplines, and I particularly enjoy working collaboratively with people from other disciplines. And some of the funding sources that have fed into the work that I've been doing recently are just acknowledged on this slide. So some general points from my point of view. I mean, as Noel has already just explained, health seems to be a national matter. National health systems are closed systems. They provide health services for a population that's coterminous with a nation or a subnational devolved entity within that nation. But of course, public health concerns, which arise in the context of a global pandemic, are far from closed or coterminous with borders. And even the healthcare parts of national healthcare systems are much more porous than we might initially think. People move across national boundaries as health professionals and sometimes as patients. Some health services themselves move across national boundaries, like radiography or data management. And above all, products move. Health products of all types are the subject of international trade. So no national health system in the British Isles is self-sufficient or self-contained in terms of either simple or complex health technologies, not scrubs, not PPE, not ventilators, nor new medicines, nor vaccines. So when trade patterns are challenged, as in the case with the COVID-19 pandemic, this is a challenge also for health systems. Some of the broader contexts that are important when considering responses to COVID-19 across the UK and Ireland, of course, include the UK leaving the EU and forging a new relationship with the European Union. So as you all know, the UK left the EU on the 31st of January, just before the pandemic hit Europe. But until the 31st of December of 2020, there was a transition period agreed under the withdrawal agreement, which meant that, to simplify, the UK in practice didn't leave the single market until then. And on Christmas Eve of last year, the terms of the future trade relationship were agreed in principle in the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So that's the first part of the broader context that we need to think about when we consider the question of the impact of Brexit to the COVID-19 pandemic in Ireland and the UK. And second, we need to bear in mind that epidemiologically speaking, the island of Ireland is effectively an entity and Great Britain is another closely proximate entity. So there are different responses to COVID-19, taking that geographical reality into account. And in the UK, health is a devolved power. So there are different responses to COVID in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales from those in England. So as well as a geographical and an epidemiological reality, there is also a constitutional and a legal reality. Although for much of the relevant time, all the relevant decision makers were acting within the confines of internal market law, those confines leave plenty of scope for different decisions in response to the pandemic. Iris Goldner-Lang, an EU law scholar in Croatia, for instance, has written recently on how the precautionary principle allowed different EU member states to take different decisions restricting mobility of people, even though this mobility falls within the scope of internal market law. Internal market law itself, argues Iris Goldner-Lang, is changing as a consequence. And even decisions which look like they involve centralized European Union decision-making, like a decision to grant a marketing authorization to a new vaccine, which is usually a decision taken by the European Medicines Agency, the decisions taken by the UK to authorize the vaccine, or this is the Pfizer vaccine on the 2nd of December 2020, and also the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine on the 30th of December 2020, are decisions that are consistent with European Union law, as they are emergency, temporary, and conditional authorizations, not full ordinary marketing authorizations. And the Pfizer vaccine was granted a conditional marketing authorization by the European Medicines Agency on the 21st of December 2020, and then the AstraZeneca one on the 29th of January 2021. And then there are decisions which would have been a national or a devolved jurisdictional matter, even if the UK had remained within the EU. So, for instance, decisions about vaccine rollout are not within European Union competence, they are a national competence. And we can see from this slide that vaccine rollout has been quite different in different countries. Israel is far ahead of other countries, but the UK looks very impressive, and Ireland is about halfway down this top table, following countries like Poland and Romania. And this slide shows us that Ireland is in line with other EU member states like France, Spain, Germany, and Italy. These slides are a few days old, so it may be slightly different now. It changes pretty much every day. But if we look more closely here, we can see some differences in policy decisions. If we look at the proportion of the population who have been fully vaccinated, i.e. they've had both doses in a 2-dose vaccine, then Ireland is actually ahead of the UK, and indeed a bit ahead of Italy, Germany, and France. So I'm going to pause there for now and go back to the more general discussion.
Thanks very much, Tamara. Again, another excellent presentation, and thanks for that data. It's great to sort of hang the discussion around some data as well. We didn't really get to see your cat, but in the first 30 seconds of your talk, my cat managed to switch on, by leaning over in his sleep, managed to switch on the TV, but luckily I was able to get on mute fairly quickly. But these domestic animals, during a period of lockdown. Anyway, I digress. We've had 4 excellent interventions looking at this from different angles, from practitioner and academic angles, from UK, Irish perspective, with obviously the common theme through the middle, the European Union. I've now got a series of questions that I'd like to ask each of the individual panelists. So I'll start with Ellie, and my first question for you, Ellie, was, I mean, I think you've alluded to this already, but do you see a more enhanced or developed public health competency emerging for the EU as a consequence of what's happened here in the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the $1 million question to some extent, isn't it? Is can the EU,
Sorry.
it wants to sort of capitalize on that to develop a broader conference? I mean, to some extent, yes, insofar as you mentioned, we're already seeing that. So we see already the wheels in motion. We've got the health programme with the greatly increased budget that over the next few years that the EU will be able to use to beef up its role in health a little bit, if you like. We then see, as Noelle mentioned as well, the European Health Union proposals, which will strengthen the mandates of some of the agencies and increase the EU's role. I think crucially, this is also in line with what we've seen in the past. So we quite often describe EU health policy as a health policy that's forged in crisis, because many of the powers we currently have been developed off the back of previous crises. So the sort of the key example there would be BSE, mad cow disease. So a lot of what we have now comes off the back of that emergency. We saw an amendment to the treaties through that. We saw the creation of an independent agency in the European Food Safety Authority, and the introduction of a really comprehensive regulatory regime around food safety. The killer question there is, well, COVID is something different. BSE was about animal health, COVID is about human health. And BSE, the regulatory regime that had to be put in place, was about quite a discrete supply chain, right? The steps that needed to be regulated were relatively manageable and identifiable. The things that would need to be regulated or addressed, or where we would need to pitch our intervention to prevent and address COVID, is obviously much broader and much more complex. So I suppose the killer question is whether COVID is enough, so to speak, to develop the kind of competence that we saw off the back of previous crises, and that I suppose will unfold as time passes.
Thank you. And a kind of follow-up question. I mean, do you think prior to COVID that there's a sense that the EU's health agenda had declined to some extent in terms of its influence in recent years?
I think it's certainly fair to say that health was not in the spotlight under the Juncker presidency of the Commission in particular, so between 2014 and 2019. So at the start of that mandate, when the Commission presidents come in, they send a mission letter to their commissioners, and the health commissioner's letter with his list of tasks and instructions was relatively short and relatively thin for Commissioner Andriukaitis, the previous health commissioner. He had, I think, 5 tasks, and most of those involved sort of contributing to work that was being done elsewhere in the Commission. If you contrast that to the mission letter that was sent to the current health commissioner under President von der Leyen, she's got a list of about 12 different tasks. And importantly, her tasks are all linked to much bigger European agendas. So things like the European Green Deal and the Sustainable Development Goals and all that. It's much more clearly within the priority list than it was under the Juncker Commission. Again, Noel mentioned the white paper on the future of Europe. That was the first time we'd seen a scenario that saw the EU not acting in health. That was new. And it was happening at the same time that there were rumours that the health directorate, so the department working on health within the Commission, might actually be disbanded and subsumed into other directorates, which was deeply concerning for the health community based in Brussels. And then you saw the budget negotiations as well. So there was, under the previous plans for the long-term budget for the EU, the health budget was going to be subsumed into a much bigger pot of money for the Social Fund Plus. So all of those things suggested that during that presidency, health A wasn't a priority, and B was losing momentum compared to what it had before that period. So decline is a strong word, but I think it's, yeah, certainly out of the spotlight is a fair characterization of that period of time.
Be the role of the EU in terms of health policy? How can it work with its member states and the UK as well as a third country? What's the balance?
Balance is probably the key word, isn't it? So I think COVID has probably taught us something about the role that the EU should have. So we've talked about how the initial response was not one that came from the EU, and we might even characterize that as the EU having not done very well in the initial response and it being much more of a national responsibility. And that probably tells us, or maybe even reflects an existing reality, actually, that the EU health policy has to be about added value. It has to be about supplementing and supporting and strengthening national health policies rather than duplicating them or overlapping with them. And again, we've, off the back of COVID, had highlighted some quite concrete and specific examples of how that can be done, and communicable diseases and pandemics and health emergencies are a really good category of topic where the EU can indeed support and help and fulfill those roles. I think more generally, balance is definitely the word. On the one hand, we've seen the EU, and we know that the EU does very well this sort of soft power role in creating networks where experts can exchange experience and information, and we can create networks where we share key resources and key findings. We coordinate our research to make sure that we're not duplicating. We fund common projects. That's sort of one side of the equation. There does then need to be, and has been to a greater or lesser extent, an EU role in identifying areas where greater health benefit can only be achieved with some degree of harmonization. So something like advertising of tobacco products, for example, would be a good case of this. That way, that's an area where we see that we're only going to get greater health benefits if everybody takes a similar approach. And there we need a bit of a stronger EU role where we see legislation and some more binding provisions. So, but I think that word balance is the important one for what kind of a role the EU takes on. In the UK case, I think Professor Harvey is probably a little bit better placed than me to talk about that, because a lot of it will be determined by the withdrawal agreement. So the EU's relationship with third countries on health is relatively thin. It has an impact on third countries' health systems quite logically through its role in trade and in development and things. But the UK, is somewhat of a special case there, and I think that remains to be seen in terms of how the withdrawal agreement and those sort of soft power dynamics play out as well, how much the UK will continue to be involved in those as we go forward.
Thanks a lot. I've got one final, more sort of general question. Do you think civil society organisations should be playing a greater role in EU health policy?
Yeah, I mean, I think fundamentally, yes. We know that there is only so much that the state and the market can do in a health system, and that civil societies plays an important role, and there is a space for civil society organisations. I also think we're seeing improvements here. So the last 5 to 10 years, the Commission in particular has really pushed ahead with trying to involve stakeholders and those affected by policy as much as possible in the policy making process, and that's a really positive thing. I think there are probably 2 things to look out for there. The first is how we ensure that all different types of civil society organisations are involved in that process equally. And here I'm particularly thinking of the distinction between for-profit and non-profit civil society organisations, where resource imbalances tend to influence the extent to which different organisations are able to be involved. But perhaps even more importantly, the other thing that we need to be a bit careful of is if we want to improve health policy, and I agree that involving civil society is the way to do that, we have to involve them not only in health policies, as we would describe them, but in non-health policies. So by that, I mean, we need to make sure that the views of patients and vulnerable groups and experts and healthcare professionals are being fed into transport policy and agriculture policy and research policy, and not just the policies that we identify as being within the health sphere, because we know that all of those other policies actually have possibly an even greater impact upon health at the end of the day. And if we take our approach to the involvement of civil society by focusing very much on health, we're going to lose that much more holistic set of drivers.
Great, thank you very much for responding to those questions so eloquently. If I could move on to Noel for a series of questions now. Noel, the first one probably won't come as a huge surprise, but what's looking back now, a few weeks on, what is your interpretation of how the EU has, so far managed to roll out the vaccination program across the EU nation states? What's your take on it?
Yeah, gosh, I feel like a bit like Nick, like yourselves. This is unusual for me to be like lecturers giving grades or something, but yeah, I mean, I think it's no surprise. I remember I was speaking before the Oireachtas European Union Affairs Committee, our national parliament here. It's EU Affairs Committee, and speaking on the whole topic of the vaccine strategy and the EU's response. And I remember in my remarks saying that the EU has entered into a 1 trillion vaccine procurement scheme with over 5 pharmaceutical companies and more coming down the track in the pipeline. And it's just incredible to see where we are, a couple of months on. So, I mean, I think we have to take the wins that the vaccine strategy has started, and aiming as it is to spread the risk across the selection of different vaccines, I think, rather than betting on any one company. And I think that was the main focus of the EU, the Commission, and in terms of the prices it paid. But then the flip side of that is, how do you value the price versus society versus lives versus the economy and versus speed of rollout? And I think that's where we're seeing somewhat of a dichotomy between what was, an effective large-scale procurement process for the vaccine versus when we look and see the pace in Israel, in the UK, how does the EU compare to that? And interestingly, Nick, I was just looking here that the OECD Secretary General Angel Gurria the OECD estimates say that for every month of containment across the OECD, there would be a loss of 2 percentage points in annual GDP growth, with the tourism sector alone being impacted by up to 70%. So these are big figures and big factors, and frustrations do exist across the slow rollout, primarily because of the supply issues. And that, I think that has been probably, if I was a larger member state, that is to the detriment of the purchasing power of the larger member state, but it has sped up the process for the smaller countries. And had the European Commission not acted collectively on behalf of the EU, there would likely be member states who would not have been able to start vaccinating their populations at this stage. And national governments could have been wasting time and in a bidding war against each other for the limited vaccine supplies that are available. I mean, we've already seen the AstraZeneca row between the EU and the UK, and who signed the contract the day before, which party. So it's not easy. And I think it reinforces that the EU probably had a slow start a little bit like, you know, my trademark quote is that we tend to nationalize success and Europeanize failure. So I think there's an element of that as well.
No, that's a very fair comment. I mean, are there any positives that the EU can take from this kind of moving forward?
Yeah, and I think other colleagues have already alluded to those, Nick. When, like, I suppose for those of us who've been involved in EU affairs and watching the EU over many years, in one way, the pace that the EU actually did act was pretty unprecedented, because we have to remember as well, we're talking about 27 now post-Brexit, 27 national governments, you know, the parliament with over 700 members of parliament, you know, we're talking about over 450 million people. But when the EU does act collectively towards a common goal, it can achieve benefits for its citizens. And I think the EU's response will have to be looked at and form, as Ellie mentioned, I want to see it form a more predominant importance in the Conference of the Future of Europe. The decision-making process must be quicker. You know, it took 3 months to launch the vaccine strategy. And look, I think people are frustrated with the rollout pace, but there is strong support, and that's a positive and a takeaway, that there is strong support amongst the EU citizens. Not universally or uniformly in every member state, that has to be acknowledged, but in the vast majority of them, that there is a strong support for the EU having a greater coordinating role. And I mentioned the 66% Kantar figures, which are the recent. But it, you know, the EU has that opportunity to be big on the big things and to be that coordinator and ensuring that member state borders did not shut down governments, and what happened with Italy, that they got the PPE and that we have the billions in funding to do that. So I suppose, yeah, the EU isn't, you know, it is an economic superpower, but it needs to become more of a, how do we get it being a practical government superpower? And that's always the challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, of course. Can I ask you a slightly difficult question? I mean, my research has predominantly been about Euroscepticism over the years, obviously a lot based around the UK and a lot based in sort of transnational terms as well. And, you know, we often talk about key turning points, triggers of Euroscepticism, and you think about the economic crisis, you go back to the Maastricht Treaty, Brexit perhaps as well for generating potential skepticism elsewhere. But do you think this could be seen as another sort of driving force for populist Eurosceptic forces, or would that be too much to kind of read into it at this stage? I'm talking from a kind of more pan-European perspective here.
Yeah. I would hope not. I would say that, wouldn't I? But no, I really would hope not. And I think when we get to Q2 and hopefully into the summer, and that the pace of vaccination speeds up, and that the lockdown containment measures are lessened. God knows if we were able to even travel, see a bit of sun, maybe, you know, that it might lead to, you know, it might lead to helping the general mood music. But notwithstanding that, I think the EU, as ever, you know, we've been trying to communicate all things European for many years, and the EU really struggles with its communication strategy, with its narrative, with its messaging. You know, and I think it needs to definitely take on board the lessons of Brexit, and also in terms of what it did well and what it did wrong in terms of this sort of pandemic from a communications and a messaging and a narrative side of things. We're going to be doing our annual Ireland in the EU sentiment poll, and it was really interesting. Back in 2019, we had Ireland looking to remain part of the EU. The sentiment was the highest ever at 93%. This time last year when we did it, it was in the midst of, just after the pandemic had started, it was at 84%. And we're going to be launching the fieldwork in the next couple of weeks. And I'm just really interested to see where that's at.
Final question for you. Do you think that the decision to invoke Article 16 of the protocol was essentially a large part due to miscommunication, or was there something deeper to it?
Well, from my conversations with sources and investigations, you know, we could write a book on that one. Yes, I think that was really, to be diplomatic about it, was really, really unfortunate. It was so disappointing because for the whole time since the referendum, 4.5 years, that solidarity, the importance of maintaining and supporting and recognizing the unique impact of Brexit on the island of Ireland, the protocol, not avoiding anything to do anything in terms of the worst effects of Brexit on the island of Ireland, and you know, the difficulties in getting to the TCA, the difficulties in getting the withdrawal agreement and the protocol, and in the span of 4 hours, 4.5 years, good work, good support and solidarity was effectively undone. Now, like, you know, the final red button wasn't pressed. It was rolled back. But it just goes, you know, it's interesting. I'll just put it out there. It's interesting that it happened after coming up to the end of the term of Michel Barnier. I think there's you know, inside the Commission, there are enough people who have worked on Brexit in previously what was Task Force 50 in DG Trade. Believe me, from talking to those officials, they have enough appreciation, recognition, and understanding of how sensitive this whole issue is and how important and just critically important it is. So for it to have happened in the manner it did on a Friday afternoon was really disappointing and unfortunate. But I do think that, you know, that lessons have been learned. It has been acknowledged that a mistake and an error was made. Vice President Šefčovič, he spoke at the Brexit Stakeholder Forum. He's engaged with Irish stakeholders, and he presented before the Irish Parliament hearings also to stakeholders in Northern Ireland. And he was very welcome, and it was very welcome to see him being frank and honest in recognising that it was a mistake, it was an error, but now it's important that we just move forward and ensure that we try to work to ensure the least worst outcome possible on all things Brexit. And the two health systems on this island as well, and the different responses. It is a challenge. It really is a challenge, and it's not easy.
Thanks very much, Noelle, for your very candid answers. Much appreciated. Fiona, if I could turn to you now, just a very general question to begin with. What's it actually been like trying to run a gallery in a museum during this kind of period of the pandemic? How's that been?
Yeah, well, I suppose on the one hand, it's enabled us to understand how we can expand internationally without increasing our carbon footprint. But on the other side, I think it's really brought into stark focus the civic as well as cultural space the museum provides. I mean, I used to be tremendously proud that one of the young participants in a creative agency program that we run for young refugees and asylum seekers once described the Glucksman as home, because it was a place where she could come and express herself. And I think, you know, we were just really keenly aware of the impact on those communities that we serve, where the museum provides creative respite. And we were particularly concerned about people for whom domestic space or the lack of it might mean that the arts would disappear from their lives, but also they wouldn't have that benefit that I spoke about previously of release. So one of the things that we did was we made the quite radical decision to repurpose one of our beautiful exhibition spaces as a place that can host safe, distant art activities for communities such as homeless families and migrant communities. And we've been doing that kind of quietly behind the scenes, you know, throughout the kind of lockdowns, obviously not in this very strict lockdown that we're in at the moment. And I think beyond that, we've been looking at how we can provide safe distance viewing, because we know as well that behaviours have changed and it is going to take a while to persuade people to come back. So we've moved off site and we've looked to create art projects in outdoor spaces using the city as a canvas. And one of the most interesting things there is the way in which there has been a new level of political cooperation, particularly from local government, to support these initiatives. So during the summer, we worked worked with a group of young refugees and asylum seekers who did an entire takeover of the facade of our city library right in the city centre with their artworks. And that just wouldn't have been possible, you know, prior to the pandemic, to get that kind of space or coverage. I mean, really, you know, important buildings in the public realm. And I think there's no going back from that in the most positive way. And it's interesting as well to see that the Irish government has announced a new fund of €250,000 for all the different county councils to create new public spaces for the experience of art. So that does question, you know, the museum is going to be really going to have to reflect on how it can be a dynamic facilitator as well as welcomer of people. And genuinely, I'm excited about that, but heartbroken that we're closed.
Thanks very much. But I mean, that all sounds, you know, very positive. You know, the developments you've taken, faced with the logistical challenges of not having the museum open. So it sounds like there has been a sort of heightened awareness of the value of creative participation, perhaps amongst Irish citizens, which is great. Do you think that the economic support for arts and culture has been sufficient over the course of the pandemic? It's a bit of a loaded question, isn't it? But what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, in Ireland, the campaign that I mentioned, the National Campaign for the Arts, I think had a huge impact, and the Arts Council received the biggest uplift it's ever had in its funding, and that will get out to artists and organisations. But, you know, we were coming from a place of severe underfunding. So I think what's interesting now, I suppose, and this is across many sectors, not just the arts or culture sectors, how we can more usefully work together. I mean, there just has to be different interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary approaches. And I think for us in the arts, that sense in which we can contribute to creative well-being or provide the locus to have, you know, the safe spaces to have really uncomfortable discussions around identity and tribal affiliation so that people can rehearse and explore and understand, because we've been siloed now into our homes. And as we emerge from these spaces, the civic space of the museum, like that public space, I think is really precious and so needs to be funded and supported. And obviously I'm going to say that.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, what lessons can both the EU and the UK and Irish governments take from the pandemic in terms of, you know, how they support arts and culture? Do you think, A, what have they learned, and B, what should they learn? Well,
I think, you know, I was on a call earlier this morning with the new director of the unit of this European Bauhaus initiative. And there's a little bit of skepticism around the naming of that, because is that too German national? You know, it's an interesting kind of framework in which to co-opt the arts. But I do feel that there is a great positivity about, in more general terms, a design-led approach to societal challenges. And that should include climate action as well as equality and inclusion and health and well-being. And I suppose just coming back to that sense of the shared spaces of experience that are required, they cost money. So, you know, at an EU level, but also at a national government level, you know, there needs to be that support. And I would say that, speaking with colleagues in the UK, there is a real concern that there has been a lack of support for the freelance community. In Ireland, there have been dedicated supports for performers whose work has been impacted. There's actually been bursaries so that artists can have research time so that they might emerge from the pandemic with new work. And that has been, you know, pretty much absent from the UK response. So that is, for me, a stark difference between the two different approaches. Sorry, Nick, you're on mute, I think. I can't lip read.
Sorry, it was bound to happen, wasn't it, at one stage? Sorry, my apologies. A final question. We're hearing quite a lot in the UK, and I'm sure elsewhere as well, about this, the concerns around artists' mobility as a result of Brexit. And I wondered what you thought that meant, you know, what the consequences are for these islands as a whole, including Ireland.
I mean, well, this is really hard to see happen. And, you know, the issue has received considerable coverage in the media as UK-based companies struggle with the enormous complexity of touring artists and performers and cultural goods without the benefit of free movement. And I think, you know, there was an article in The Guardian 2 days ago where the director of the Hofish Schechter dance company said that Brexit is going to have a far bigger impact because it's a long-term restriction. And that sense that we are this flexible, dynamic sector and can work our way out of COVID just isn't there if people can't, you know, produce and export work or co-produce in a meaningful way. So I think it is going to be devastating. And yet interesting for Ireland because we have this common travel area. So we have this kind of weird space of potentially, I mean, one of the things I'm talking about with some of my colleagues in the UK is how we might be the partner with them back into Europe. You know, again, like on that call with all European colleagues this morning, the lingua franca is still English. So I would say that you know, there is a role in which Ireland can really hopefully leverage and continue to include people in the UK who want to be involved in European projects in that way. And again, the only thing that I want to say, I mean, I'll refrain from putting up a favorite slide of mine. Mary Murphy and Jonathan know it. It's by the artist Michael Landy, and it's just, he redid the European flag with Brexit instead of Brexit. And the challenge there is actually that the cultural community were almost entirely pro-Remain. And, you know, there is an issue. I think that there's a reflection point now required about what communities are they not engaging with if they didn't, you know, if to ensure that there isn't a kind of a divide or an elite divide that feels that culture is here and we're not, you know, that something else is on the other side. So I think, yeah, for us going forward, there's just no getting away that Brexit is terrible for the art sector, but hopefully we can still be part of the solution.
Thank you. Thanks for your excellent and nuanced interpretations of the situation. It's much appreciated. So we'll move on to Tamara now for the final set of questions, and then hopefully we'll have some time for some questions at the end. You answered quite a few of the questions in your presentation, I think, Tamara, that I had sort of planned to ask you. So I'm going to keep it on the topic of Brexit, if that's okay. I mean, do you think that Brexit will have an impact on healthcare provision generally, both in the UK and Ireland and elsewhere?
Yes. That's what my research has been about since 2016, probably. So the impact of Brexit on health in the UK, this is our model that we use to track this. We've published three big papers. The fourth one on the trade and cooperation agreement is in work in progress at the moment. And so Brexit is bad for health. This is our early analysis showing the worst types of Brexit, different types of Brexit are worse for health. So the right-hand column is a no-deal Brexit. So we avoided the absolute worst type of impacts for health. This is an analysis of the future relationship when we had just the political declaration. What's interesting about this analysis is that even the Northern Ireland Protocol provisions, there's nothing much good for health there. Across the board. And then when we look at the TCA, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, that's also bad for health, although not as bad as no deal. We haven't, there's no table form of our analysis on the TCA, but we've submitted evidence to this UK Parliamentary Committee. So yeah, Brexit is really bad for health in the UK. Brexit is also quite bad for health in the EU, but it's bad in a differential way. And here I've published a paper in the Journal of Health Policy, Politics and Law as part of a special issue led by Catherine Ferlbeck in Canada, where I look at the external effects of Brexit on health. And there's both a geographical difference, and there's also a kind of sectoral difference. So in terms of the geographical difference, the closer that a country is integrated with the UK in terms of its health provision, the worse the effects of Brexit are. So Ireland has it worst. But also countries, maybe perhaps surprising countries like Malta, also have there's a really bad effect on Malta and health in Malta for of Brexit. And then there's also a kind of sectoral disparate response. So in terms of medicine supply, for instance, that's not necessarily as negatively impacted as we might think. The European Medicines Agency's move to Amsterdam actually is being presented as an opportunity for the Netherlands and for the EU to develop more capacity, because the EU relied on the UK's MHRA for a lot of its scientific capacity there. Now it needs to develop new capacity there. So yeah, is Brexit bad for health? Yes, it is.
Thank you, Tamara, and thanks for sharing your research with us. That's excellent. Follow-up question, where does Northern Ireland fit into all of this in terms of, does it differ, the effects differ from Great Britain, from the Republic of Ireland? What's Northern Ireland's situation at the heart of all this?
So, as I already said, Northern Ireland has a separate health system. So does Scotland, so does Wales, and we saw some differential responses across the different UK devolved entities. I'm trying to pick my words, my descriptive words really carefully here. I'm a lawyer, so I can say jurisdiction sometimes, but it doesn't always work and it doesn't work terribly well in this context. So in Northern Ireland, the geographies played a really important role in terms of determining COVID policy responses. So there's a paper published by Colfer last year that talks about how the Irish approach to COVID response is much closer to other European countries than the UK's approach. And that approach is more led by expertise, whereas the UK's is more led by political considerations. And Colfer actually links this to the Brexit narrative, and specifically that statement that Michael Gove made, that Britain has had enough of experts. But Northern Ireland actually, by early April in 2020, Northern Ireland was departing from that and actually aligning much more with the Irish government. So on the 7th of April 2020, the Irish government and the Northern Ireland executive have signed a memorandum of understanding about sharing data modeling, discussing possible policy responses to COVID, and discussing common messaging to COVID. It wasn't a legally binding memorandum of understanding, but it was, it was an important statement of intent and kind of recognizing that geographical and epidemiological reality. Right now, although England is already sharing this roadmap, which I think is a very unfortunate metaphor, towards removing all COVID-related restrictions, and England's reopening schools on the 8th of March to all pupils, Northern Ireland's current restrictions will remain in place until at least the 1st of April 2021. So we've got very clear policy and legal divergence there in the different parts of the UK.
Thanks very much, Tamara. Thanks for your very candid responses. We're running out of time, but I think we would all have to agree we've had four excellent interventions, four excellent 5-minute introductory talks about specific aspects of this very complex situation that we find ourselves in. And I've also much enjoyed the responses from our four panelists to the question that I posed. Very, very much on the ball, very candid, very honest interpretations. We have about 10 minutes left, and I'm conscious with the, it's very rare that the sun's been shining in Hertfordshire where I'm sitting lately, so I'm pretty sure that we probably don't want to overrun this session. But we do have about 10 minutes or so to take questions, so I see that John O'Brennan has raised his hand, so I think rather than ask people to write questions in the chat, let's get people to come off microphone and perhaps ask their questions individually. John, would you mind doing that?
Good afternoon, Nick. Thank you very much. Thank you to you, to Mary, to Jonathan, and to Emily for organising this session. It's just a comment rather than a question. Like others, I've watched the sense of drift in EU-UK relations over the last 6 months, the last 6 weeks rather. It's alarming in all kinds of ways, and it's not just about the Irish protocol, goes, I think, way beyond that. So I think more than ever, the kind of individual, bilateral, and collaborative relationships that are manifest in an event like this have got to be maintained and, wherever possible, enhanced. So I really salute UACES and IACES for bringing people together in this kind of forum, and I'd hope that in different iterations in the months and years to come that we'd be able to maintain those links between the UK and Ireland. I think it's absolutely critical that we do so, because at the political level there are going to be some extraordinary challenges, and I think we have something positive to offer both practitioners and epistemic communities in general, in our case as scholars, to maintaining a good relationship between the UK and Ireland. That's what I hope, at least, and I'm very grateful to both organisations for bringing us together.
Thanks very much, John, for that very positive message, with which I concur 100%. I see there was something posted on the chat by Dr. Stephen Monaghan about the last 2 slides from Tamara's presentation, and I think Tamara has responded. Tamara, is there anything you'd like to sort of say beyond that? What you've put in the chat, or nothing to add?
Not really. I mean, I'm not a doctor or even a public health person. I'm a lawyer. There might be others in the room who would like to respond, though, in the virtual room.
If there is anybody else that would like to respond, please do so. Is there anybody else who would like to ask any of our 4 panelists a question relating to what they've said, what we've discussed generally, or if they've got, similarly to John, an observation that they'd like to make? Now is your opportunity. We do still have 6 minutes left on the clock.
Alan Dukes and Vivian.
Sorry, Alan. Where's Alan? If you could say what you want to say, Alan.
Yes, Nick, there's a lot of discussion lately about interferences with freedom of movement. Is this not all a bit beside the point when even within member states we're looking at restrictions on movement? President Macron and Angela Merkel have both been getting a bit excited about this lately. But in a situation where in France, in Ireland, in the UK, we're looking at internal restrictions on movement, isn't it a bit over the top to be worried about that pillar just at the moment?
I mean, it's a good question. Are you directing that to any of our speakers?
Well, if anybody wants to be indiscreet about it, I'd be happy to hear it.
Would any of our speakers like to respond to Alan's observation / question?
I mean, I could jump in to say that,
Ellie.
Yes, I see the point, and yes, to some extent, perhaps. I think just to think about the Commission's position very explicitly when it was trying to address this at the beginning, the problem was about supply chains. If you know, the lack of movement in the States is one thing, but if the vaccines and the PPE and the masks and everything else can't cross the borders from the state next door, then that's where the Commission and the EU can come in and try and do something about it. So yes, I agree, but I think it's probably about different problems. The internal one is maybe more important for us on a day-to-day basis, but there is still a need for the EU to come in and try and do something about the restrictions between states as well, just as one side of it, perhaps.
Thank you. Vivian, I think had she'd like to ask her question.
Yes, so we've been hearing today about the proposal for a reset of UK-EU relationship, some new negotiations to kind of try to change the direction of travel of the last few weeks. Where do you see health and response to COVID especially play a role in that reset?
Good question. Is that directed to a specific speaker, Vivian?
Not really. I think lots of speakers can jump on that.
Okay, who would like to go first? Tamara, have you got a response to that?
I'm not sure that I buy this reset narrative. I do think that the Article 16 protocol incident was highly unfortunate. Others have already spoken about that, so I won't say more about that, but I'm really hoping that that was an aberration and a mistake and not a sign of the situation. What I think needs to happen now is that we really need to start to understand the legal and policy environment that's embodied in 3 different sets of legal instruments. The trade and cooperation agreement between the UK and the EU. And what does that mean for things related to tackling COVID? So that's trade in the products, but it's also things like movement of people. It's about opening up the travel and, you know, all of those things. The second thing is the withdrawal agreement with the Northern Ireland Protocol. And that's really, really important aspect of the relationship between the UK and the EU going forward. And it's absolutely critical for people like me and Ellie, who are based in the UK, to keep saying Northern Ireland is different. Do not say the UK when you mean England. Right? And that's really, really important. We just have to keep doing that. And it's something that all social scientists across both jurisdictions can do. And the third thing is the complicated legal and policy provisions that make up the common travel area. And so, you know, if you want to ask something that sounds really simple, like what's the law on COVID policy in the British Isles as a geographical entity, you need those 3 legal things. And you need to understand what they mean. And this is just the legal part. Like, I'm just talking about the law side of it. Other people in the room can talk about the policy and the practical side of it. It's really complex. And I just think we need to just steady ourselves and start to understand, what does this mean? We've chosen this we, not me, I didn't choose it, but you know, we collectively have chosen this new relationship, and now we have to get on with it. And it's, if I may just say one more word, Nick, it's so heartwarming for me to sit in a virtual room like this and hear people like Fiona say, we want to be your friends, we are your neighbours, we are not leaving you. And we want to carry on working with you. And yes, it's complicated to carry on working with you, but we're not shutting the door. It's on a personal level and on a professional level. I can't tell you how much it means.
That's excellent. Thank you. I wonder whether Noel or Fiona have got anything they'd like to add about this potential reset before we close.
Yeah, no, thanks, Nick, and you know, Tamara, here. Okay, so absolutely, you've got friends on this side too. No, look, really good points. And can I just say, I fully agree with John O'Brennan's point. I think, you know, chapeau to Mary and to Nick and to your respective communities, because I think these types of initiatives are really, really important. And they're actually going to get more important, because a bit like John, I'm very concerned at the, and I'm going to use this word deliberately, but there's the frostiness maybe that's in the relationship. And the direction of travel it's going in. And I think, you know, we've spoken about the protocol, but let's not forget, you know, the UK internal market bill, the anger that generated and the upset that caused, you know, triggered way back. Like I remember, you know, when Brandon Lewis made those comments in the House of Commons, you know, so there's a lot of misunderstanding, and there's a lot of hurt and upset. And I think in terms of keeping the relationship, there's going to have to be a lot of bilateral engagement. You know, we know that there's going to be the 19 or so committees, there's the working groups, there's the officials meetings, but that's why events and such as these and collaborations such as these are going to be more and more important, because you know, we've seen the impossibility and the challenge of reversing over 40 years of negative discourse, of diatribe, of negative rhetoric in a you know, a 6-week or so campaign. It's just not possible. And I think how the communications around COVID as well, and how that's portrayed as well in terms of the vaccine and this vaccine race war, it just really isn't helping. So I think the constructive collaborations such as these are vital, because you know, as I always remind my European Movement UK colleagues, or Scottish colleagues and Northern Irish colleagues, like for many years in a European movement context, I was the only person, you know, speaking on behalf of our British friends, and it was a lonely place. It was a lonely place because for many other EU countries and member states, they've moved on. Brexit was never a top 3 priority for them the way it is for us here on this island. So I think, how do we overcome those challenges and those complexities and ensure as productive and a meaningful as relationship is important, is going to be hugely critical, and it is underpinned by strong communications, I think.
Thank you very much, Noelle. Fiona, would you like to have the last word before I wrap things up?
Well, actually, I wanted to thank you all in this joint for including culture in the conversation. And it seems to me that diversifying and giving plural experiences, you know, a platform is the way forward. And if we were all to take that back into our own sectoral discussions and survey the room and make sure that the UK or our colleagues in the UK are included in those discussions, or find ways to make those discussions more plural, we will continue in some sense the European project. So thank you, Nick and Mary, for having me here.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Well, look, everybody, I think it was a wide-ranging and extremely interesting discussion. We've covered many different aspects of this complex, troublesome and ongoing topic, or is it set of topics? You know, rest assured, from UACES' point of view, as a UK-based association, we are fully conscious of the situation in which we find ourselves. And we will do the very utmost we can to kind of keep the flame of European studies and the UK-Irish relationship and the UK-EU relationship, and where Northern Ireland fits into all of that complexity, we will do our utmost to keep that alive. The only thing it remains for us to do, and I would suggest that those of you that are still in the call, if we could just come off mic and give a huge round of applause to Ellie, Noelle, Fiona and Tammy for their giving up their time and for their excellent participation in this afternoon's seminar. So my thanks very much to all 4 of you, and to IACES, of course, for their organisation, their end. And I'm looking forward to the next talk. Watch this space. Thank you very much.